He was nominated by the American Party in 1972 as their candidate for the presidency of the United States of America. Reared in the Midwest, our speaker graduated from Marquette University, and following in his father's footsteps, he chose to enter the teaching profession. After a tour as an aviator in the United States Marine Corps and holding the present rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves, he became a college instructor and active in the political affairs of his community and his state. He was elected to the California State Senate in 1964, where he gathered the respect of his colleagues, friends, and foe alike, simply because of his firm convictions to those principles of Americanism and constitutional government. In 1970, he won a special election to fill a vacancy in the United States Congress, and in November of that year, he was returned to the Congress by the largest vote given to any congressional candidate. As a presidential candidate in 1972, he spoke before more audiences and traveled the nation far more extensively than his opponents. And despite a virtual press blackout, he received well over 1 million votes and served as a rallying point for what will be an upswing in a returning surge of Americanism in the political arena. A member of the National Council of the John Birch Society and proud to be a Bircher, speaking on the purpose of the United Nations, it's an honor for me to introduce to you a real statesman, the Honorable John G. Schmitz.
Thank you very much, Chuck. It's nice being here. You know, I never felt as bad about losing my bid for the job as Commander-in-Chief as tonight in listening to Scott Stanley. You know, it just grieves me to miss that great opportunity to appoint Scott Stanley the last United States ambassador to the UN. You know, you've already heard 5 separate views of the United Nations. If you didn't know it before, you've now got a pretty good assessment of the communists, criminals, and one-world conspirators behind the United Nations. When you add up what you've heard tonight about the origin, the morals, the finances, the crimes, and the composition of the United Nations, 2 inescapable conclusions logically jump right out at you. The first conclusion is derived from the simple fact that what you've heard described here is not the result of an accident, or a mistake, or a series of accidents, or a series of mistakes. That many mistakes or accidents is just not reasonable. So, my first conclusion is that the United Nations exists because the communists, criminals, and one-world conspirators want it to exist. And they want it to exist because they want it to be the formal seat of a one-world tyranny which they are building. There, my friends, is as logical a purpose as any for the United Nations, a one-world tyrannical government. The second conclusion is derived from the easily demonstrable fact that the United States government's presence, prestige, and money is absolutely essential to the United Nations. Therefore, in the interests of free men everywhere, my second conclusion is that the United States should get out of the United Nations. Now, some in the audience tonight or some Americans listening to a recording of this program at some future date may wonder at this point whether I'm not guilty of what we call in logic a hasty generalization. Obviously, each of the speakers here tonight was somewhat limited, as as I am. But let me assure everyone that the evidence to support this conclusion is overwhelming. If you aren't convinced, then please examine the evidence yourself. Get one of the UN packets and read it through. There's a great deal more information in the packet than any group of speakers can provide in a program such as this. Now, getting on to another point, over the years, I've discussed the subject of the UN many times from many different angles. I've encountered a number of arguments in favor of the UN, but perhaps the most common is that the UN can't be considered pro-communist because it was the UN which fought the North Korean communists in the Korean War. On the surface, that seems to make sense to a lot of people. But there's quite a story behind the UN's efforts in Korea, and it needs to be told. Without going into the many long-range communist gains which resulted from the Korean War, not the least of which is acclimating a whole population here to no-win wars, but let me mention a very important resolution which occurred as a result of the Korean War, namely the Uniting for Peace resolution. When the UN was proposed, the fear of the use of UN armed forces was uppermost in the minds of many people, many who were in nations and even prominent in nations considering membership. The UN Charter put their fears to rest, however, because it said that the use of armed force could only come about as a result of the unanimous concurrence of the 5 permanent members of the nine-member Security Council. Since the United States was given a permanent place on the Security Council, there appeared to be no reason to fear that the UN could ever institute armed force against us or any nation friendly to us. All we had to do was withhold assent to such a proposal. And the USSR, another permanent member of the Security Council, could do the same to protect her own interests or those of her friends. So we joined and they joined the UN, others joined, and we have what we have today. When North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, a proposal was offered in the Security Council calling for UN troops to oppose the North Korean aggression. At the time, however, the USSR was not attending meetings of the United Nations. She was engaged in one of what at that time were frequent boycotts. So the Security Council couldn't legally obtain the unanimous consent needed to authorize troops. Nevertheless, troops were authorized, and they did go to fight the no-win Korean War. By the way, that really wasn't called a war, it was called a police action. First we had wars, then there were police actions, now they're called ceasefire violations. At any rate, moving on, some months later, this obvious circumvention of the UN Charter became an issue. So in November 1950, the Uniting for Peace resolution was offered in the General Assembly. That's the cave of winds that Scott was talking about, where each nation has equal vote, except the Soviets have 3. In effect, this resolution amended the Charter. Its provision said that whenever the Security Council failed to act in the face of a, quote, threat to the peace, end quote, the General Assembly could authorize the use of armed force. The significance of this change is simply this, that naked aggression by the UN itself could have easily been stopped when it came from the Security Council, but there is no such capability when it comes from the General Assembly. A resolution to use armed force against any nation, including the United States, can now be made effective by a 2/3 vote in the General Assembly. 2/3 vote of the members. Now you ask the question, could they, or could the UN ever send troops against this country? Would 2/3 of the members want to use force against us? All one has to do to answer that question is to recall that 2/3 of the UN members, in effect, voted Nationalist China out and read China in to the UN. You remember that time the anti-American feeling was such that, in fact, the euphoria, it was outright euphoria. There was dancing in the aisles. In other words, what happened? Scott mentioned 132 members. The membership of the UN was half that when it was started. And in the 21 years from 1950 to 1971, the increased membership meant a complete reversal of our 2/3 majority at the time of the Korean War. In other words, from our 2/3, it switched from the other side's 2/3, and we are now, without a veto, at the mercy of the General Assembly and that group which was dancing around in the aisles at the expulsion of nationalist China. I'd say that the UN is a threat to us for this reason, even if there were no other reasons. What we're facing here, of course, is a conspiracy, an organized drive to deceive us into accepting tyranny. No one accepts slavery willingly, but often tyranny is imposed through deceit. Only occasionally is force used. Right now, we're being deceived into accepting certain rules by the United Nations. And if we wake up to the deceit, it seems quite probable that a two-thirds vote would use armed force against us. The logical thing for us to do is stop our financing of the UN and at the same time get out. Now, let's look at the whole subject of the United Nations in another way. Let's examine what would be logical for the communist conspiracy relative to a world government. We know that from their own statements and from even a cursory study of their history that communists mean to rule the world. Wouldn't it be logical for them to work to establish such a body as the UN? Wouldn't it be logical for them to promote high-sounding ideals and clever slogans to entice the unwary into their grasp? Wouldn't their organization become a haven for communist tyrants like Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai? Of course. Looking at it from the communist point of view, the United Nations is an absolute necessity. That's exactly why they founded it, dominate it, and use it so effectively. Well, then, what do we do about the United Nations? You heard a few moments ago from Congressman John Rarick. He's recently introduced a resolution, H.R. 1414. And this resolution, as you know, is to get the U.S. out of the United Nations. But he knows, I know, and I hope that you know, that his resolution has little chance of success unless a great many more Americans learn the truth about the UN. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear. Most men in political life are followers, not leaders, in spite of what they or anyone else tells you. When the American people wake up to what the UN is and demand that we get out, the politicians will follow. So I urge whomever hears these speeches to learn the truth and then spread the truth. Let's make the demand to get the U.S. out louder and louder so that politicians can't risk ignoring it. Only then will John Rarick's resolution get the chance it deserves. Now, I ask you to do this for many reasons. For yourself, for your children, not the least of which is that when I get back to Washington, I want this matter taken care of so that I can deal in a mop-up operation of I want to have this taken care of so I can just be the mop-up operation taking care of the international monetary situation, the Mideast situation, and that being taken care of, we'll all go on, and I don't mean to sound corny, but we could live somewhat happily ever after.